Hey, it's Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be doing a selected reading from Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s by Christopher Caldwell, and we'll be doing the reading Vietnam War Generation and Class. The Vietnam War generation was not made up of maligners, agnostics, or cynics. Its battlefield heroism from the four-day clash at Ai Tarang in 1965, which began when a battalion of the 7th Cavalry was dropped by a helicopter into ambush in a rainforest, to the intensive, infernal, multi-week siege of Khe Sanh in the wake of the Tet Offensive in 1968. Matches anything in the annals of American combat. That heroism stuck in the popular imagination less than fraggings and intentional maimings or killings of officers, and other incidents of indiscipline. Under the circumstances, one might have expected worse. Soldiers who had been told they were defending freedom of the Vietnamese people arrived in the country expecting to be loved and supported. They weren't. One infantry lieutenant who had interviewed the villagers day after day for a year recalled, "I never once heard Vietnamese say, 'Don't go down the trail, there's a mine.' The sense of betrayal must have been unfathomable." But it dented the patriotism of the younger generation much less, and more selectively and slowly. The later accounts would lead to one to think. The top-selling single of 1966, according to Billboard magazine, was "You Can't Hurry Love" by the Supremes, which came in number 8, nor the Trogs' "Wild Things," number 24, or Beach Boys' "Good Vibrations," number 33, nor anything by Simon and Garfunkel, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, or Bob Dylan. It was Barry Sadler's material ballad of Green Berets when, in November that year, Robert McNamara made a visit to Harvard and found his car surrounded by 100 protesting Students for Democratic Society members, SDS. One dean wrote to convey our deeply felt apology for the discourteous and unruly confrontation he felt yesterday by members of the Harvard College community. A petition of apology quickly circulated among Harvard University undergraduates, and within 48 hours, more than half of them, 2,700, had signed it. In late 1968, after the Tet Offensive and riots at Chicago's Democratic Convention, the war was opposed by a majority of those over 50, but supported by those younger. But the leadership class that had emerged out of the late 1960s was not a sociological cross-section of the generation the way the leadership class that came out of World War II had been. It was highly atypical. That was contingency that would wrap American society and politics in half a century that followed. For one thing, it was heavily selected for non-participation in every opposition to the war. It had been mostly the working class and poor who had fought overseas, mostly the university-educated elites who protested back home. Enrollment in higher education had given the latter an automatic deference from military service as long as they could afford to study, an exemption that the Johnson administration eventually curtailed. An outrage editorial in the Harvard Crimson in 1968 called the end of such deferments a careless expediency, clearly unfair to the students who would have filled the nation's graduate schools the next year. They were protesting as much to keep themselves out of war as to end it. In a diary he kept in 1966, the Harvard undergraduate Stephen Kellman recorded the misgivings of a friend who had said, "I'm against the war, I guess, but I wouldn't want to fight in any war. My brother had a friend who tried to get a 4F by eating a load of sugar 2 days before he went for a physical and not pissing until they think he had diabetes. They gave him a 4F, but that afternoon he fell into a sugar coma and died. I could try freaking out, coming in high on pot or doing the homo routine, but they picked that kind of rejection on your record, and that could screw up your life." Years later, Kellman's Harvard contemporary James Fallows would recall traveling on a bus to the Boston Navy Yard where draft-eligible classmates who shouted pro-Viet Cong chants and threw urine samples into the faces of their orderlies. The Harvard students hoped that the undesirable character traits they manifested would keep them out of military services. Fallows himself got a medical exemption by dieting down to 120 pounds. As they left the bus ride with more draftees who Fallows describes as boys from Chelsea, thick, dark-haired young men, the white proles of Boston, most of them younger than us since they had just left high school, and it had clearly never occurred to them that there might be a way around the draft. In 1968, when 135 students affiliated with the Students for a Democratic Society occupied Harvard's University Hall, Harvard professor of Irish literature John Keller, a working-class Irishman from Lawrence, Massachusetts, called them spoiled brats with an underdeveloped sense of history and a flair for self-protection. The occupation was broken up by policemen from surrounding cities, many of whom had sons and brothers in Vietnam. Scenes like this were happening all over the country. At Columbia University, SDS staged demonstrations against the building of a gymnasium in the nearby Harlem neighborhood. They morphed into larger protests against the Vietnam War and racial inequality, where the police handed the kids roughly to. Part of brutality, wrote historian Todd Gilton, reflection of the class war SDS had not reckoned with, working class cops' resentments of the children of privilege. As civil rights had divided the country by region into those who were heroically fighting for equality and those who could just be assigned to have moral instruction, Vietnam did the same by class. The defenders of peace and justice were disproportionately found to be at rich men's universities, and their innocence of military involvement would give them much more in common with those who came of age in the demilitarized decade or so that followed. The working class would wind up by a tainted popular culture's portrayal of militaries as burners of villages and marauders in free fire zones. Who would hire such a person to run a corporate department? Who would elect such a person to Congress? The same white proles of Boston Fallows describes would be subject to most high-handed carrying out of federal law in the decade to follow. The court ordered desegregation of Boston public schools starting in 1974. The word desegregation belongs in quotations because most of the schools affected within the white ethnic, mostly Irish and Italian American neighborhoods. There had not even been any blacks there to segregate. The process involved two-way busing, transported white students into poor and violent Boston neighborhoods and replacing them with bused-in black students. When the whites of South Boston and Charleston protested, their neighborhoods were put under military occupation. Southie had a curfew and laws against public assembly, enforced by 1,600 police officers, 100 federal marshals, and 50 FBI agents, and 600 National Guard troops. Whites made up 60% of the public school system on the eve of busing, and less than 20% when it has finally done its work, little more than a decade later. Judge W. Arthur Grady, a resident of wealthy 100% white suburb of Wellesley, and an author of the court ruling that mandated busing, appointed a panel of distinguished experts to study the controversy about William Booker for the 17 years the president of the Massachusetts Senate equipped. They were distinguished as far as I could see, only in the sense that not one of them was a parent of a child who would be affected by the forced busing. Relative to their fellow citizens, privileged Americans took out of the Vietnam era a sense of their own authority that was not battered but strangely enhanced. The moral basis for overthrowing the egalitarian order established by Franklin D. Roosevelt had been laid. Whether one praised that order or assailed it as prostitution, New Deal, liberalism had been built on a one-size-fits-all uniformity. The protests against the Vietnam were a sign that the old 9th century rules were regaining the shaft. The novelist, late Senator James Webb, wrote shortly after the war that America had shown itself too afraid to ask the men of Harvard to stand along the men of Harlem, same uniforms and education in the same country. Now young men who as grad school students had grasped when they learned that the northern rich had been able to pay substitutes and die for them in the Civil War were themselves seeking to carve out in the middle century of the common man a niche that was worthy for elites to live in. I am convinced that when the history of these decades is written 150 years from now, the columnist and critic Irving Kristol wrote in 1979, there will be a chapter called The Aristocratic Impulse. In April 1969, a member of Progressive Labor, a Maoist anti-war group at Harvard, wrote a soul-searching indictment of the more fashionable students for a democratic society, accusing SDS of drifting towards elitism, but explaining that drift in terms of temptations common to mount the entire student left. On one hand, we were angry about the war, about racism, and the countless vicious attacks we saw around us, but on the other hand, we viewed America as one great wasteland, a big, monstrous, mechanized, air-conditioned desert, a place without roots or feeling. We saw the main problem, really, as the people, the ways that they thought, acted toward each other. We imagined a great American desert populated by millions of similar crass, beer-drinking grains of sand living in a waste of identical suburban no-places. What did this imagined great pigsty of TV watchers correspond to in real life? As middle-class students, we learned that this way, the working class, was the racist, insensitive people. Things already going on at the time of the Vietnam War inclined privileged people to look at average America as the country's